As hazy nautical days passed by in the year of 1861, the tensions between the southern and northern regions of the United States grew, whilst an imminent war was approaching. The American South, who were the Confederates, ultimately believed in slavery and the use of black slaves to grow crops for their agrarian economy. However, the North, who was the Union, opposed these unscrupulous actions and wanted the South to change its system. These moral disagreements, in accordance with the secession of the states and states' rights disputes, led to the Civil War. In the end, the destruction to the southern infrastructure and a major economic process that the northern economy pursued proved the war to be both a triumph and tragedy. In the antebellum South, the southern economy was prosperous as the prices of cotton rose up more than 50%. This rise in the price entrenched the agrarian economy of the South. On the opposing side, the North experienced tremendous industrial success. They had a highly developed economy that utilized new machines and technology, such as those in factories, which gave them more war supplies towards the war. The North also had better transportation networks, such as railroads and canals, and a much larger population, which was a potential source of legions of military troops. With the advantages the North had, it put the South at a great disadvantage. In the election of 1860, President Abraham Lincoln was elected president, despite not having many Southern votes. As a Republican, his anti-slavery aims feared many Southerners, and as a result, Southern states began to secede and form the Confederate States of America to maintain and expand slavery. However, it was not viewed well by the Union. After years of disagreement, the Civil War began in 1861 as the North waged war on the South. This arose mainly from the divide on slavery. However, the secession of the states, disputes over states' rights, and sectionalism played smaller factors. In the beginning of 1893, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared any slaves held in any state would be free. However, this was limited as it did not free all the slaves. It only applied to those states who seceded, leaving the border states exempted. This policy enraged the South because their primary economic source was threatened. And this new decree also granted blacks the ability to become soldiers and fight in the Union, giving them more overall troops and a greater advantage in the war. As many battles ensued, one of the most significant events during the war that devastated the South was Sherman's march to the sea. In late 1864, Union General William T. Sherman and his troops captured Atlanta, Georgia. This was a triumph for the Union, as Atlanta was the industrial center for the Confederate South, which provided the Confederates with many necessities during the war, like food, weapons, and other key supplies. Shortly after they raided Atlanta, Sherman and his troops headed towards Savannah and burned many plantations down, slaughtered many different farm animals, and took as many supplies as they could. The aim was to hurt the South and prevent them from fighting at full capabilities by raiding and burning down its overall infrastructure and causing them defeat. These raids proved to be successful, and the Confederates eventually surrendered, ending the war. Amid of the gloomy year of 1865, after the Civil Wars ended, the South faced a severe devastation. Cities were burned down, Southern plantations were in despair, Southern infrastructure ceased to exist in this new culture, and the population of the South drastically declined. The South lost its economic power and experienced a tragic end of a cultural and economic system. The Union armies left the social infrastructure of the South in ruins. Nearly 2/3 of the South's railroads, bridges, and other transportation services were reached by the Union Army and destroyed. Restoring the infrastructure became a high priority for state governments, though the costs of the war left a high toll on the economic infrastructure, totaling $3.3 billion. The first act of Reconstruction was the ratification of the 13th Amendment by Congress in 1865, which abolished slavery. For African Americans, the mistreatment and indignities mitigated, and they were let free from social order and restrictions, and were able to celebrate their newfound freedom in a triumph. As plantations were destroyed in the war, they became free from slavery and other restrictions. Migrations of these freedmen to the cities gave them jobs and more economic opportunity. The entire economy of the South had to be rebuilt as slaves were emancipated, and a new tenant farming system known as sharecropping emerged. Sharecropping was one of the only options that former slaves and poor whites had to make a living in the rural South. Sharecroppers were forced into the system as they were pressured by the economic circumstances they faced, and often pressured by the black codes to sign these contracts. The system allowed sharecroppers to work land owned by someone else and then pay the owner 2/3 of the crop as payment for renting the land. As they were only able to sell the harvest to the landowners, they were put into a continuous debt, and the economy remained stagnant for many years. The South straggled behind in industrialization and the growth, while the North experienced a triumphant economic growth after the war. After President Andrew Johnson gave the Southern states rights to make their own laws and manage affairs, black codes were enacted in many Southern states to limit the rights of blacks and reinstitute a similar restriction to blacks that slavery once had. The codes infuriated the Northerners and were overthrown by the Civil Rights Act in 1866 over President Johnson's veto, affirming that all citizens would be protected by the law. African Americans soon began to hold more political positions in office, as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments defined their citizenship. Though as Reconstruction efforts began to cease in the 1870s, efforts of white supremacist forces such as the Ku Klux Klan undid any political gains they had made. After the period of Reconstruction passed, state legislatures, who were part of the Confederacy, re-established the idea of white supremacy. They passed laws known as Jim Crow laws, creating segregation and disenfranchisement, which proved to be a long-term problem for blacks. In its Plessy v. Ferguson case, the Supreme Court ruled that the separate but equal doctrine did not violate the 14th Amendment, which declared anyone born in the United States is a natural citizen. The public facilities given to the blacks were in fact inferior to those for the whites. The Jim Crow laws were long-term laws that impacted the lives of blacks, causing decades of social unrest until the civil rights movements in the 1950s, which finally seized the laws. The American North began to prevail economically in the late 19th century after the war, with transportation tycoons such as Cornelius Vanderbilt, who helped make railroads easier to manufacture with a new abundance of steel. Steel was inexpensive at the time, and this allowed businesses to prosper and were able to grow, and the economy greatly benefited. The Civil War's effects proved to be significant in aiding to the Northern's economy and paving way to the new technological advances, and its success, which is still prevalent today, is greatly beneficial. The American South struggled for many years to rebuild its economy and reframe its culture after the Civil War. The industrialized North experienced a triumph as they defeated the Confederacy and prevailed economically in the years following the war through railroads and industry. The South, on the other hand, experienced an impoverished tragedy as they lost their slave-based economy system and faced the destruction of the social infrastructure. The Civil War had a profound effect on these two societies, outlining the idea that Southern tragedy led to the North experiencing triumph. The Southern struggle, in many ways, is still evident today, and the overall effects of the Civil War help shape our modern society as it is today.